from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight from Washington, 1 year later, it's President Trump versus the world.
How far are you willing to go to acquire Greenland?
You'll find out.
Is Trump willing to cross America's closest allies in pursuit of Greenland? The Prime Minister of the Arctic Islands says it's time to prepare for a possible military invasion. Former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta is standing by to weigh in. Also today, Sell America, high anxiety rippling across global markets on fears that we could be headed towards a full-blown trade war. Can Trump's economic team ease tensions as President Trump departs for the World Economic Forum in Davos? We'll unpack it all tonight on Balance of Power. And we start there with developments in the president's fight over Greenland. The president today revealing the, quote, many meetings scheduled on the matter when he arrives in Davos tomorrow for the World Economic Forum, as the future of the NATO alliance hangs in the balance. Here's what the president told reporters this afternoon on the one-year anniversary of his inauguration.
I think something's going to happen that's going to be very good for everybody. Nobody's done more for NATO than I have, as I said before, in every way. Getting them to go up to 5% of GDP was something that nobody thought was possible. And pay. At 2%, they weren't paying. At 5%, they are paying. And they're buying a lot of things from us, and they're giving them, I guess, to Ukraine. That's up to them, but they're giving them to whoever they're giving them to. But they're buying a lot. I think that we will work something out where NATO is going to be very happy and where we're going to be very happy. But we need it for security purposes. We need it for national security and even world security.
Joining us now with the latest, someone who is in that room today with the president. Live from the White House North Lawn now is Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan. Kate, it's great to have you with us here. That was a tour de force. I believe it was over an hour before the president even began taking questions at what was billed as a news conference with reporters. But this is the one-year anniversary. Was it about to mark the accomplishments that have been made or to set the stage for what's about to happen in Davos?
The White House definitely was using that opportunity. The president was using that opportunity to really tout his achievements from the first year. But it's really notable, you know, the president leaves for Davos tonight, and there's really no sign that he's backing down at all when it comes to his threats of acquiring Greenland, which is, of course, threatening to completely upend the NATO alliance and is really alarming allies. The president's escalating rhetoric appears to be turning this economic forum that initially was supposed to be an opportunity for the president to unveil some new housing policy. It's now really turning into an emergency diplomatic summit. The president went on a bit of a tear on social media last night and posted what appears to be his private text messages with the French president and the head of NATO, who both specifically mentioned Greenland. But today marks the 1 year of the president in office in his second term, and it is striking how much tension there is right now with allies and how the president really seems to be focused on interventionist foreign policy as opposed to domestic issues heading into this year's midterm elections.
You had a chance to ask the president a question today, Kate, and it had to do with one of his many posts from last evening in which he invoked his failure to win the Nobel Peace Prize as part of the motivation behind his actions in Greenland. Let's play for our listeners and viewers your exchange.
You told Norway's prime minister.
Are you from Norway?
No.
You look like you would be from Norway. But she looks like she's from Norway. Go ahead.
You told Norway's prime minister that you not winning the Nobel Peace Prize made you feel less obligated to think purely of peace.
Well, I lost a lot of respect for Norway. And I believe very strongly that Norway controls the Nobel Prize. But you have to understand, I settled 8 wars. I've had every one of those wars, every participant wrote, I didn't ask him to do it. They sent in strong they make recommendations for that. But I settled 8 wars. No president's probably ever settled 1 war. I don't know, think of it. I did 8. The reason I do it is because it's easy for me to do. And I didn't do it for a Nobel Prize. I did it because I'm saving a lot of lives.
We can confirm that Kate is American-born. That, of course, following his post, Kate, last evening to the leader of Norway, writing, "Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace." How should we read into that?
It's a great question. You know, what I was trying to ask the president was, why should him not winning a prize change the way that he's approaching peace, and how much is that really linked to his push now to acquire Greenland? I think it's really notable that he made that link himself in that text message. So it's clearly something that is on the president's mind. It's something he cares about, and it's now something that's affecting how he's conducting foreign policy.
Is this a prelude to his speech tomorrow in Davos? Kate, he's on Air Force One tonight. We'll be speaking at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow, East Coast time.
There are a lot of questions about what the president is going to be focused on in that speech, especially after what we saw today. The president was asked, can you give us a preview of your message to allies there, and can you talk about the housing policy? And he essentially said some version of, we'll be talking more about our achievements and what I've accomplished in the first year. So I think there are still a lot of questions about how focused this speech is going to be and what the message really is going to be.
Great work today, Kate. It's great to have you. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan in a freezing cold Washington, D.C. today. On the precipice of that presidential visit to Davos tomorrow, Wall Street saw its worst sell-off since Liberation Day back in April. Stocks, bonds, the dollar, all tumbling today after President Trump threatened new tariffs on European countries that support Greenland. For a closer look at today's market response, we turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. This was a familiar feeling, Romaine.
A bit of a familiar feeling, though somewhat different texture. We talk about the Sell America trade, if that sounds familiar. We were kind of here roughly about a year ago. In fact, you look at those numbers on your screen right now. There are a lot of superlatives there. Worst day since October, lowest level since November, on and on and on. But I want you to look at the differential between what happened in the U.S. and what happened in the rest of the world. The outperformance of non-U.S. assets, that's been a big story to start the year. In fact, in about 7 of the past 9 weeks, we've seen that underperformance by U.S. assets. And I bring that up, Joe, because we saw this about a year ago in the early days of the Trump administration, kind of late January into February and March, when there were all these concerns about tariffs and the potential impact on the global economy. Of course, we saw a big reversal in that trade as we got deeper into the year, but more importantly, a reversal as Trump backed off some of the most extreme policies that he had proposed on the tariff front. So the big question for you, Joe, and for a lot of your guests right now is, do we think that Trump will back off on some of these threats on Greenland, on potentially Canada, and quite frankly, on everyone else? At least for right now, investors taking a much more cautious approach. You saw that reflected not only in the downdraft we saw in stock prices, the updraft that we saw in the VIX, the bid that we saw into gold, and more importantly, the bid that we saw into non-U.S. assets.
Well, Wall Street loves tacos, Romaine, and we have to wait and see on that one. But I have to ask you about Netflix, because it's finding ever lower ground in the after-hours session after reporting quarterly results. I realize that investors are concerned about the outlook, but does this have anything to do with Warner Brothers?
It has a lot to do with Warner Brothers. In fact, they beat on several key metrics in the most recent quarter: 17% revenue growth, 25% profit growth. But going forward, Joe, there are a lot of costs associated. The company said it's going to increase its spending on content by about 10%. It also says it's committed to that to that Warner Brothers deal, $82 billion, more than half of that, which is going to be funded by debt that Netflix is going to take on. And that's giving investors a lot of concern as to whether Netflix can actually protect its profit margins. We should point out they're speaking on a conference call right now saying they think they can continue to grow margins, and they think they have the best deal for Warner Brothers shareholders. A reminder, Joe, that tomorrow is the deadline for whether Warner Brothers will actually, shareholders, will actually favor the Paramount Skydance bid over Netflix's all-cash bid. That will be the big question as we move into tomorrow. But right now in the after-hours trade, Netflix shares have been under tremendous pressure, down more than 4% right now as we speak.
Boy, that's tough. I look forward to the Netflix series about this when it's all said and done. Romaine, thank you. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick getting us started on a shortened trading week. We return now To President Trump's latest Greenland tariff threat and the global implications, in a conversation with Euan Panetta, as promised. The former Secretary of Defense, former CIA director in the Obama administration, is with us live now on Bloomberg TV and radio. There's been a lot of talk of 4D chess today, Mr. Secretary, and it's great to see you. I wonder how you're looking at this. If the president is, in fact, about to blow up NATO as we know it, and whether that would be worth acquiring Greenland for what he says are essential national security reasons.
Well, Joe, in my experience, foreign policy is handled one of two ways. One is to work with others, to negotiate, to do some give and take, to arrive at an agreement that protects the security of both parties. The other is to be a bully and try to threaten others, threaten them with tariffs, threaten them with military action. But if the rest of the world holds tough and pushes back, I don't know how President Trump can continue to make these threats, because in the end, it's going to hurt our economy and it's going to produce an affordability problem in an election year. I don't think he wants that.
Well, we've heard a lot today about the world order as well. Even Mark Carney, in his new trade deal with China, said this is acknowledging the new world order. Is that where we are, Mr. Secretary, or is this going to be another escalate only to take credit for de-escalating when the president arrives in Davos tomorrow? Have we seen the worst of this?
Yeah, I just don't see how the president can continue to threaten, continue to try to bully others, continue to say he's going to take over Greenland, continue to say he's going to take over Canada, he's going to take over Mexico. The bottom line is that if these countries, particularly the European countries, hang tough and then engage in a tariff war, it's the United States that's going to be hurt by this. And so I think the president has a decision to make. Does he really want our economy to be impacted as we go into an election year? Or is he going to try to sit back and try to negotiate with those that I think are willing to negotiate? I mean, in Greenland, all he has to do, very frankly, is negotiate with Denmark, negotiate with Greenland, and he can protect the security of the United States. So that is going to be the test, whether he's going to continue to be a bully or whether he's going to try to negotiate. And I have to bet that ultimately he tries to negotiate.
Interesting. I don't know how much negotiating is going to be happening with Emmanuel Macron, who got his own special social media post over the weekend after refusing to join what the president is calling his board of peace. He is the chairman of the board, it seems, in the White House, according to a report first from Bloomberg, is charging $1 billion for each permanent seat on that board. And of course, Secretary, this is with an eye on Gaza, rebuilding Gaza, but it seems the president has bigger thoughts on this, and he was asked about it when he arrived back in Washington from the football game last night. Let's listen.
Do you have any response to President Macron saying he will not join the board of peace?
Oh, did he say that? Well, nobody wants him because he's going to be out of office very soon. So, that's all right. What I'll do is, if they feel like Costo, I'll put a 200% tariff on his wines and champagnes, and he'll join.
Do you invite President Putin to join the...
Yes, he's one of the people. These are world leaders, and the answer is yes.
All right, so if you had trouble hearing that question, it was about Vladimir Putin. The reason why Macron refused to join the board is because Vladimir Putin has also been invited, and he's not the only figure who's been brought into the conversation not closely associated with making peace. Secretary, what is the point of this board, and what would be its impact if nothing more than a shadow United Nations Security Council?
Joe, I think you and I have to agree that these are weird times. And this is another weird proposal to create a peace plan where you become a member of the the Peace Council by paying $1 billion to become a member. And we're not quite sure how it's supposed to operate, who is going to be the chair, how it's supposed to even function. And so I see this as kind of another almost impossible approach to trying to provide peace in Gaza. I mean, the plan that was agreed to would have had a few key players as part of a board. That made sense. But to open it up this way to the highest bidder, I think is going to lead nowhere in terms of trying to provide what I think all of us want, which is a peaceful resolution to what's happening in the Middle East.
You seem more incredulous than usual today. Is it just me?
No, I think it's the headlines that that just make me sense that we're living at a time when, frankly, I think I often tell the students at our institute that in a democracy we govern either by leadership or crisis. If leadership is not there, then we'll govern by crisis. And my sense is we're governing by crisis right now.
It's been 1 year to the day. How would you describe this first of four?
It's been a roll of the dice, and I'd like to be able to believe that it's all based on a strategy for where we need to go as a country. But my sense is that rather than any kind of comprehensive strategy, this president basically just rolls the dice with every issue that confronts him.
It's great to have you back with us. I hope your year is starting out well. Euan Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense, former CIA director, we thank you. Coming up, Wall Street had its worst session since April of last year. As we have noted, we're going to talk about how global markets are watching all of this unfold. The president's pressure campaign on European allies coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. Sell America, the headline on many market stories today, as stocks, bonds, the dollar all tumbled after President Trump threatened new tariffs we've been discussing on European countries that support Greenland. The president demurring when asked whether those tariffs would imperil the nearly $1 billion in promised investments from EU partners. For more, we bring in the voice of Euan Rellie, co-founder and managing partner, BDA Partners. Euan, it's great to see you as someone who is sensitive to the markets and geopolitics. I wonder your thought on that today, if this is sell America once again, or if we're just taking some profits a week after hitting all-time highs.
I think we're definitely in the realm of sell America. I think markets in Europe have been really spooked. I've talked to a bunch of investors today who are really spooked that President Trump is not only threatening a trade war, but apparently threatening a war. And that's something feels like new territory.
Which means that global markets still take the president at his word. Remember the taco trade? Is that gone?
Well, I was preparing for this segment, and I think we might get back to taco. I hope we're back in taco next week, because that would be risk on again. Of course, this sell America trade is risk off globally. But we're seeing some pretty significant beneficiaries from the rotation, for example, into European tech, where ASML is up 75% this year. And even in Asia, Taiwan Semiconductor is up over 62% this year. So, the Mag 7 is down, but the European and Asian equivalents are going up.
We heard from the CEO at UBS today about diversifying away from the U.S., as you are just now describing. Let's hear his comments from earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Diversifying away from America is impossible. I think that in any major asset allocation, one could probably think about having an overweight or underweight, but diversifying away from the U.S. and also from the dollar is a quite dangerous bet.
Sergio Armati talking with us earlier at Davos. This is the problem if we extrapolate this by a couple of weeks, right? Because a lot of folks remember the Liberation Day swoon following the president's announcement back in April. If you simply held on to everything you had, it all came back to you pretty quickly. Euan, is it different this time?
It's too early to tell. And, we know that President Trump famously sets out a very extreme position only to try and negotiate somewhere in the middle. The question is, how seriously should we take these threats against Greenland? Because I think if there isn't room for compromise on Greenland, then we have a major problem, which is going to discourage global investors, really for the first time, potentially in my career, really discourage investors from putting money to work in the U.S.
Yeah, interesting. Well, the question becomes here whether there's going to be a major buying opportunity, because this gets us back to the whole taco trade. But when we back off of this, how important will be the president's words tomorrow? Markets are going to be listening. It's going to be before the start of trading. And if he's on time, maybe it'll coincide with the open of trading. This could be a pretty sensitive moment for stocks and bonds in the morning, no?
I take it's going to be very sensitive, and I think people are feeling fragile across Europe and across the world. Yeah. Look, I think the rest of the cabinet takes their position from the president's comments. He's been very, very outspoken to date, but we're already beginning to see some of the cabinet colleagues rein in a little bit. My hope is that we're going to be back in the sphere of taco trade next week, that there'll be room for compromise. But I think this is a time where I would expect to see many participants keeping some money off the table, hedging their bets, holding back to see whether there's a move towards a more moderate position. Definitely the weekend felt pretty extreme.
I don't mean to get too lofty on you here, Euan, but before you leave us, how deeply are traders thinking about this? Or maybe I should ask you, how deeply are investors thinking about this? Does our economic security depend on this military alliance?
We all need the U.S. to succeed. That's something that every investor in the world wants. And I think part of the reason for concern and fragility at the moment is, if the U.S. is no longer able to play the role of that shining light on the hill, then where else do we have to look? And I think we've seen, markets are watching both the UK and Canada reach out to China a little bit, and that's a pretty fearful moment that we may not be able to look at the US anymore, because frankly speaking, we all want a healthy Wall Street and a healthy US economy.
Sure. It's amazing we're even having this conversation. I've got about a minute left, Euan. If the bottom falls out again tomorrow, what are you buying?
This is a very difficult moment, but I think European defense stocks, which have been growing at about 75% in value every year on average for the last 3 years, I think they've got further to go. Because if European countries don't feel that NATO has a future, then the only alternative is to defend themselves. And in some ways, maybe that's a healthy thing. We're seeing a return of some sort of national pride across Europe, some sort of European consistency and stability. And of course, the European leaders are trying to figure out how to respond. But I think the European defense industry and defensive stocks like utilities across Europe feel really well placed.
He comes packing goods. Euan Rellie, it's great to see you, and co-founder, managing partner, BDA Partners. Coming up on Balance of Power, we'll continue our conversation on the potential economic impact of President Trump's latest tariff threats. It's next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Sit back, relax. I am confident that the leaders will not escalate and that this will work out in a manner that ends up in a very good place for all, for national security, for the U.S. and for Europe.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. That was the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent this morning in Davos on the president's push to acquire Greenland. involving potentially tariffs. The president now threatening a 10% tariff on European nations that oppose his plans, work with Greenland. Joining us now with insights, Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson. Wendy, it's great to see you. We've been around the track on tariffs a lot of times before, and when you look at the markets today, the declines that we saw brought a lot of people back to April. In fact, it was the biggest drop for the S&P 500 since April. I guess the question becomes, what takes place tomorrow, and whether these tariffs were just an attempt to get attention before the president arrived in Davos?
Well, Joe, that's exactly what Scott Bessent seemed to be saying there. And I think the whole world is hoping that Bessent never has to eat those words, that, you know, everything's going to be fine. Trump sounded a similar message in his when he came into the White House briefing room today and talked to reporters for almost 2 hours. He said, you know, don't worry, when I get there, everybody's going to be happy. NATO's going to be happy. Greenland's going to be happy. But he's walking, if he thinks it's going to be easy to turn them around, I think he's walking into a buzzsaw tomorrow, where, you know, where he was going to essentially make a midterms election pitch on the economy at this World Economic Forum. Instead, he's going to be having emergency meetings with, you know, European leaders who are going to try to walk it back. You know, ultimately, I think they probably will reach a deal, some sort of deal, because the alternatives are too awful. But, you know, we'll have to see how Trump handles it tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. This is not making the president's search for another Fed chair any easier, nor is the DOJ criminal investigation into Jay Powell. But we understand, as he hunts for the elusive unicorn, that we could have an announcement maybe upon his return from Davos. Wendy, what should our viewers and listeners be expecting here?
Well, one can never tell in the Trump administration when things will happen. Again, Scott Bessent is sort of at the core of this at the moment. You know, Trump wanted him for the job, but he's happy as Treasury Secretary, and I think Trump is happy with him too. But he is the one who's been pushing for a January announcement because Powell does leave the chairmanship, at least in May. And so, but they're looking for, as that story we had on the terminal that called the search for a unicorn, you know, they're looking for someone who will project independence to markets, but will also do what Trump wants. And searching for someone who fits that bill is very tricky. At the moment, Rick Riordan of BlackRock seems to be in ascendancy, while Kevin Hassett acknowledged on Sunday that he was probably not in the running anymore. But then there's Waller and Kevin Warsh. So, you know, with Trump, you never know until it happens.
Well, while we're talking rainbows and unicorns here, Wendy, consider the optics tomorrow. We all know that affordability is the big issue here, the president's not favorite word in the midterm cycle. Lawmakers talk to us about it every single day, and he's going to be discussing ways to get prices lower in this speech tomorrow. Many have questioned, why would you go to this billionaire gathering in Davos? The optics are horrible to deliver a message to the American people. Or is he shrewd, Wendy Benjaminson, by going there to shame the billionaires in their backyard?
Well, if he did that, that would be shrewd. He sort of projected today, however, in the briefing room, that his message is going to be, I inherited a bad economy and fixed it. Period. End of sentence. And however, I mean, if he sticks to the teleprompter, as you know, I've been saying to you for a while, like, he never sticks to the teleprompter. But if he does, he will be walking in to billionaires and industry leaders and saying, you know, corporations can't own rental properties, and we want credit cards to limit interest rates to 10%. If he does go ahead with announcing all of those to this audience, which are already well known and well vetted, then that will be an interesting moment. But what he presaged today was, I'm going in there to tell them I fixed it.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to unpacking it with you. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson. Thank you, Wendy. World leaders are responding to the president's tariff threats and the potential impact on the European economy. Listen.
We are constantly experiencing new provocations. We are constantly experiencing new antagonism, which President Trump is seeking, and we Europeans must make it clear that the limit has been reached.
Blackmail between allies of 250 years. Blackmail between friends is obviously unacceptable. To my knowledge, this is the first time that an economic instrument tariffs, which you know we don't think very highly of, has been used for geopolitical reasons.
Alliances endure because they're built on respect and partnership, not pressure. That is why I said the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong.
We do not want this escalation. We do not want a trade dispute with the United States of America. But if we are confronted with tariffs that we consider inappropriate, then we are in a position to respond. And that is precisely what we will be discussing in Brussels on Thursday.
All right. So you're getting the idea. Joining us now for a look at the economic impact of the president's renewed tariff threats, Meredith Crowley, professor of economics, University of Cambridge. Meredith, thank you for joining our conversation. I'm trying to figure out how to look at this, and I'm wondering if it should be through the scope of national security or trade. How about you?
I think this is more something about national security from the U.S. perspective. I mean, it's really difficult to understand what President Trump is trying to achieve, but I think this is about national security is where he's starting. One would think logically he must have some concerns about security in Greenland. The question is, what does he really want the European Union and other European partners like Britain to deliver on for the U.S.? And so I think it's just a no-go. There's no way Europe is not going to stand with Greenland and ensure their independence and sovereignty. So then the question is this going to crumble the NATO alliance? I think the Europeans don't want to go in that direction at all. They absolutely want to, put a lid on the boiling pot, get tempers down, and then ask the president if there is something concrete he actually wants that they can deliver on in a reasonable way. Throughout much of the chaos of the president's announcements over the last, year or so, Europe has consistently tried to quiet the situation. They're not quick to react with actual tariffs, but they're very smart and shrewd, and they like to state what they would do if they get pushed hard enough. And that's where they've announced some future tariff restrictions on American goods if things really get bad.
Yeah, we got a taste of that over the weekend. EU ambassadors meeting Sunday. $93 billion was the number that I heard, Meredith, in retaliatory tariffs on American imports if Trump's tariffs kick in on what I guess is our new Liberation Day, February 1st. But you're talking about potential fallout here, and all that might be the case. If that doesn't work, though, they go nuclear, right? These European nations are considering what some refer to as the trade bazooka, which is something that was designed, this anti-coercion mechanism that was designed to deal possibly someday with China. Now here we are potentially watching Europeans use it against the U.S. Emmanuel Macron spoke to this as a real option. Meredith, here's what he said.
Europe has very strong tools now, and we have to use them when we are not respected and when the rules of the game are not respected, by the way. The anti-coercion mechanism is a powerful instrument, and we should not hesitate to deploy it in today's tough environment. We must also advance the principle of European preference.
We should not hesitate to deploy it in today's tough environment. What would it mean for the U.S. economy if they did?
Well, it depends exactly which parts of this anti-coercion instrument they decide to deploy. So what it is, back a few years back, China took some action against Lithuania. The Lithuanians were really unhappy. It had some negative consequences for them. So Europe came up with a bunch of things they could do if a country tried to push somebody around again. And among them, there's tariffs on goods. A potentially much more powerful tool in the arsenal are retaliatory actions on digital services trade. So American corporations sell services in Britain through electronic means. They also could do some really tough stuff like stop inward investment into the European Union from the United States. Those types of restrictions would be much more immediately damaging, I think, to American businesses who would then, you would expect, come to President Trump and say, you got to stop this. So I think at the end of the day, the Europeans aren't going to want to action this unless it is absolutely necessary. But I think they understand that President Trump likes to have a sort of strong person or institution against which he's, is boxing. And so they won't be afraid to tell him how far they might go. But I think really the European sense is going to be, how can we dial this whole situation back? How can we, get the United States to understand that it committed a long time ago to ensuring the sovereignty of people everywhere and, allowing people in different countries to have the right to, choose their own government. That's a sort of core foundation of American foreign policy for decades. So they're hoping.
Well, it was just a few days ago. Sorry, Meredith. It was just a few days ago we saw Mark Carney sign a trade deal with China on behalf of Canada. If they use the trade bazooka, do Europeans then turn to China, maybe Russia, as their new trade partners?
Well, they're not going to turn to Russia. The situation with China is actually pretty tricky in the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen, the president, has introduced import restrictions on Chinese electric vehicles being sold in Europe. And they feel within Europe they're in quite an intense amount of competitive pressure on some more high technology products. So while a real aggressive trade war with the United States would lead them to engage more with China, basic European policy has been trying to put more restrictions on European trade with China. So they don't have a great sort of option off in the China direction. I mean, they're non-military goods, some types of areas where they would like more trade and investment with China. But at the same time, I don't think they're going to suddenly, jump into China's arms because they have a series of longstanding concerns that they're working on right now.
Well, we're going to find out together, Meredith. She's professor of economics at the University of Cambridge. Meredith Crowley, thank you for the insights. Coming up, Mikey Sherrill sworn in as New Jersey's newest governor. We'll bring you the details. And we mark 1 year since President Trump's return to the Oval Office as he continues to strain relationships with European allies. We'll talk it out with our political panel. They're up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll bring in our political panel next. First, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Active duty troops and Minnesota National Guard have been placed on standby by the Trump administration as protests over immigration enforcement persist in Minneapolis. Roughly 1,500 soldiers are waiting for possible deployment following escalations in the city after federal immigration enforcement operations resulted in a fatal shooting, of course, involving an ICE officer. The president has repeatedly threatened invoking the Insurrection Act if the unrest continues. Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife Usha are expecting their fourth child, a boy, due in July. The couple sharing the news in a social media post today. The Vances have 3 other kids who have occasionally appeared at official events during the vice president's first year in office. New Jersey got a new governor today as former Congresswoman Mikey Sherrill was sworn in as the state's 57th executive. Sherrill taking the occasion to accuse President Trump of, quote, illegally usurping power via tariffs, and also vowed to go toe-to-toe with the administration over immigration crackdowns. Her swearing in following the weekend inauguration of Sherrill's former House colleague Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. Republican Oversight Committee Chair James Comer refusing to interview former President Bill Clinton under oath over his role involving the Jeffrey Epstein files, saying the terms offered for it were, quote, unreasonable. That according to the New York Times. Negotiations between the Clinton and committee apparently breaking today, just before a scheduled vote to hold both Clinton in contempt of Congress. It comes exactly 7 days since the former president skipped the committee's hearing. Joining us now with their reaction to all the stories we're following today, and it's been a doozy. Megan Hayes is with us, Democratic strategist, former special assistant to President Biden, alongside Republican strategist Annalise Keller, partner at 7 Letter. Great to see you both. Welcome. We survived 3 days of something, and I'm not sure exactly where we are right now. Annalise, the president's going to climb on a jet tonight. He's going to fly to Davos. Have we seen the worst of this standoff over Greenland? Was he simply escalating to de-escalate? Or is tomorrow the new Liberation Day?
I think he is escalating to de-escalate,
Yeah.
but I don't think we've seen the end of it. I think it will continue. There are obviously going to be a lot of market. I mean, there already have been a lot of market reactions to what he's doing with tariffs.
For sure.
I do think that can be somewhat of a backstop for him. We've seen when he gets pressure from his economic advisors and when he sees stock market moves, that can influence him. But I think he's going to kind of say more of what he said today at the White House briefing. He's not going to be willing to take any actions off the table, which I think is going to continue to make people nervous. And maybe then in a week, maybe in 2 weeks, he will begin to de-escalate and negotiate. But that sort of seems to be his the way he operates.
He said a lot at that briefing today. In fact, he spoke for 80 minutes before he took a single question, which is remarkable. Try it sometime. I'm just wondering how we should be looking at this moment. It was the 1 year anniversary, right? He's walking into mark 1 year back in the White House. And he went through the first 10 or even 15 minutes showing mug shots of people, immigrants who've been arrested. No script, no real agenda. It took him maybe a half an hour to kind of get rolling on some of the stuff that we're talking about here. And it ended up being a couple of hours long. And it makes you wonder how Joe Biden would have been received in a moment like that. Is it a preview of what we get in Davos tomorrow?
I mean, I'm sure he's going to go on a litany of his complaints, probably blaming Joe Biden and, frankly, that the media is not understanding what he's saying. But I think the problem here is what he says is lies. And one of the fact checkers at another network called it a litany of lies. So it's hard to even take what he's saying seriously in these types of environments. He goes out there. He did not have very much energy. You did not see him even really light up until people started asking him questions to which he gave answers that nobody could understand or even follow half the time. So I just think that this is just more of what we're going to see as the Trump administration continues to go on. And I think people are exhausted by it. I think that's why you're seeing so much of the polling start to shift towards Democrats in the midterms, and how the economic polling here is not great for them. And so if they don't change course on his behavior, and part of his behavior are these long press conferences and long, just drawn out comments, they're going to see more Republicans start to shift towards Democrats or stay home and not vote.
Well, there's, long news conferences and a lot of posting. I think 6,000 truth posts, according to the Wall Street Journal, in his first year. They actually somebody had that assignment to count them all, which is incredible. Because that news conference today, or briefing today, followed a litany of posts overnight, to the point where he was even posting private text exchanges between himself and other world leaders. This went on beyond 1 o'clock in the morning. If my kid did that, we'd have a family meeting about it. How should Americans be interpreting this kind of activity?
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me of some of the health concerns that we've had about him, some of the testing that he's had recently. And also, obviously, this year he's going to be our oldest president.
Well, that's right.
And there is a little bit of, folks saying that he is getting older, he's slowing down. And then you see things like this, and he's clearly not sleeping a whole lot. He's clearly very engaged on the issues. I mean, I think a lot of people are more worried about affordability, and they want that message to be coming through rather than some of the content around Greenland that he was posting.
As a strategist?
I certainly am. I think that, to Megan's point, the midterms are an inflection point, and a lot of people are going to be either staying home because they feel like the economy's not working for them. And a lot of these things, a lot of these movements with the economy, even if some of them are trending in the right direction, either they're not happening fast enough or people are not believing it. And that is what needs to change. People need to feel that. Now, one thing he talked about today, which I'll be curious if he is able to do without the help of Congress, is $2,000 checks to the American people.
Yes.
He indicated that he thinks there's a way to do that with tariff revenue outside of congressional channels, which I'm not, sure how he would accomplish that. But, those are things that I do think people are going to see as we head into the midterms, when he is still trying to turn that message of the economy around.
Well, we had the assignment of retracing the last year in Donald Trump's political life, 1 year to the day. You remember freezing back on January 20th last year? It was so bitter cold they had to go inside for the inaugural, for the swearing in. I guess someday that'll be in a ballroom. But before we try to qualify or define the president's first year in office, let's remember the ways.
The golden age of America begins right now. Today, I will sign a series of historic executive orders. With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. The inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending and escalating energy prices, and That is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier.
Reminding us we've all aged in the last year. A peacemaker and unifier. What say you as our Democratic strategist?
Look, I think this is why that he has not done anything on Ukraine and really taken a strong stance on Ukraine. He thinks what Putin did in invading a sovereign nation is okay, as he's looking to do that to Greenland. It is just unconscionable that he thinks he is a peacemaker when you are talking about invading sovereign countries or territories. So I would just think it's gross and disgusting. But also these $2,000 checks that he was talking about is just admitting that the tariffs have cost the American people a ton of money. They're the ones that are footing the bill here. Energy costs have actually gone in the wrong direction. They are going up, and he doesn't have a plan to fix this. He cares more about things that are important to him. Ballrooms, where does his family making money? And the American people see it. And to Annalise's point here, they can say the economy is changing, but they are falling to the same trap that the Biden administration did. No one actually is feeling the difference, and they're feeling worse. And I think that's where the Trump administration is really lacking what their progress is.
Well, you know, one of the big stories today is what did not happen today, and that was the Supreme Court ruling on tariffs. So we'll park that because that's going to be a big deal when it happens. But when you're into this second term by 1 year, which feels like to many a decade, just because of the cadence, the incredible news cycle that we're in. How is he doing? He says it's been obviously a huge success. He defines the economy as A+++++. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the foreign policy, just quickly, and then we'll get back to the economy, but I do think he's made a lot of headway in foreign policy. Now, he's not ended the conflict in Ukraine, but he has made a lot of progress. He's brokered a ceasefire in Gaza, now on the second phase there. You know, he's done a lot. And frankly, I think that focus has made it harder for him in the second year for Americans to feel like that affordability, economic development has been on the right track. I actually think that, you know, he really likes to see himself on the world stage. Right. You know, obviously he's talking about buying Greenland here, and you know, those things. I think he kind of can't help himself but want to be on that national stage. And so even if there is a lot of, you know, I can commend him for doing a lot of great work across the world, but I think he needs to focus this year on the economy. Gas prices are down. It's true that there has been some inflationary improvement, but there is a lot more to do here domestically. And I would say, you know, in terms of a grade, I don't think I would give him 6 A+, but I think he's got to kind of turn his attention here to the U.S.
Tomorrow could be an interesting one. He's going to speak before the market opens. Do you expect that this is the beginning of some major Liberation Day swoon? Just in our remaining 30 seconds here, or is tomorrow just going to be another day where we taco and bounce back?
I think that you'll see the market go down. I think people are reacting already to what he was saying with Greenland. I think the world leaders are really nervous. Adding tariffs is extremely challenging. And when you start to see the text messages get leaked where these people are trying to baby him to have less action, it's embarrassing on all levels.
It's going to be a fun flight over tonight. Annalise Keller and Megan Hayes, thank you for being with us, and you on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.